Thank you for watching this brief tutorial video on annual assessment reports. This video will give a quick overview of assessment on our campus and then look more closely at questions on the annual report template. Our current process is for departments and academic support units to submit annual assessment reports by June 1st of each year. Resources and templates for assessment can be found on the web page on this slide. If your program has not yet submitted an updated assessment plan, please include it with your annual report in June. You can find a separate tutorial on creating assessment plans at the link on this slide. All instructors are familiar with assessment in the classroom, though some are newer to the idea of reporting on assessment for their programs. Generally, assessment is the process by which programs and institutions articulate what students should learn, how students demonstrate that learning, evaluate effectiveness, and make action plans based on the results. So while faculty are always engaged with assessment when working with students in courses, annual assessment reporting focuses on student learning at the program level. While course level outcomes are used in this analysis, annual reporting looks at student learning in terms of how a department or unit's program learning outcomes, or PLOs, are being met. This does not need to be an arduous process, and faculty can readily adapt assessments they are already using regularly in their teaching to evaluate program-level outcomes. This kind of embedded assessment will be described more in a moment. But program-level assessment takes at its starting point that a program has alignment between its course outcomes and assignments and the goals of the program itself. We'll briefly review those elements before we look at the template. And methods of assessment can include both direct and indirect methods. Direct would be tests, portfolios, projects, posters, exhibitions, performances, and so on, while indirect would be surveys, interviews, focus groups, in other words, a means to gather student perspectives on their learning. Let's briefly look at the three levels of learning outcomes that will be involved in your assessment analysis. Institutional learning outcomes, or ILOs, are the skills we expect students to master by graduation from our university. These are, by necessity, the most general of the outcomes. Program learning outcomes, or PLOs, represent what we expect students to be able to do at the end of a degree program. These can be developed for each degree program in a department, though some departments prefer to have broad program outcomes for their entire department, usually clarifying undergraduate from graduate outcomes. And student learning outcomes, SLOs, represent what we expect learners to be able to do at the successful completion of a course. These are the outcomes that are listed on course syllabi or standard course outlines, and which inform the design of assignments for a course. As you see in the graphic on the right, for program-level assessment, we want to have in place an alignment of connections among all components of a learning experience. You can see how at the bottom of the graphic, it illustrates significant activities and assessments from a course, which are aligned with measurable course outcomes. These course-level outcomes are underneath larger umbrella outcomes for the program on the whole, or the PLOs, which in turn live under the broadest outcomes, the institutional learning outcomes. As departments work on their annual reports, they are encouraged to consider how equitable practices inform their curricula and pedagogies and feed into their assessment practices. Naturally, equitable assessment takes as its starting point equitable pedagogical practices, as how we assess student learning is directly connected to the goals and strategies of classroom learning. As mentioned, the goal of annual assessment reports is to analyze student learning from the point of view of a program's goal, or PLOs. A good starting point for examining if students are being assessed in an equitable way would be for departments to take a close look at their stated program learning outcomes. Some reflective questions might be, which subgroups of our students are struggling and which are excelling? What are the needs of our underrepresented students? What actions can we take to address any gaps in learning? How can all of our students' cultural identities be nurtured to support learning and a sense of belonging? To this end, a department's PLOs can be examined through an equity lens to consider how stated goals support and serve the learning of all students in a program. These are important conversations at the department level which require time, deep reflection, and collaboration. Now let's look at the annual report template itself. To begin your assessment, the first decision you need to make is which PLO you are assessing this academic year. This should correspond to your multi-year assessment plan, which already should list your schedule of PLO assessments according to your review cycle. The first question asks which program learning outcome or PLO was assessed and how is it linked to our university's ILOs. For this question, indicate which ILO the PLO you are assessing is aligned with, keeping in mind that PLOs can be aligned with more than one ILO. As already mentioned, ILOs are the most general outcomes and therefore serve as an umbrella outcome for PLOs to live under or within. Please don't worry about the alignment being too specific. The ILOs are intentionally very broad. You can follow the URL link on the template to find our 6 university ILOs. The next question on the template asks you to describe the direct assessment used to measure the specific PLO mentioned in question 1. For this question, you'll need to determine a meaningful course with learning outcomes that are aligned with your PLO. Naturally, your multi-year assessment plan should already list representative courses for this evaluation. But generally, you should consider the type of course that is best aligned with this PLO in terms of its course-level learning outcomes. This should also be a course that a majority, if not all majors, participate in, though it could be an introductory course, a foundation course for the major, or a capstone course. When you have identified which course or courses will be used for your assessment, you will need to decide on a significant instructional activity to directly measure assessment of learning. If helpful, you can click on the web link in the document to find further examples of direct assessment in the resources area. Please keep in mind that direct assessments may vary a great deal from department to department and can encompass a wide variety of activities, including writing assignments, oral presentations, self-reflective essays, lab reports, film critiques, research projects, exhibitions, recitals or performances, and so on. What's important is that the direct assessment method used is meaningful in helping to understand student learning within the larger context of the program. Since existing coursework is already being used by the instructor to measure student learning, these are the activities you will be selecting from. This type of assessment is called an embedded assessment, which indicates that you are evaluating assignments, activities, or exercises that are already being done as part of a class, but are being used to provide assessment data for program-level analysis. While some faculty may decide that creating separate assessment activities outside of regular classwork are important to analysis they are interested in many cases the use of embedded assessment strategies will be an efficient means of gathering measurable evidence on how students are doing in a course. Naturally, these are only effective if the assignments are aligned with the learning outcomes of the course itself. Since embedded assessments are not separate from the normal teaching and learning process that goes on in the classroom, the process is more organic for students and impacts faculty workload far less. Here are some additional considerations as you decide on your assessment approach. Though as instructors we're used to assigning grades in our assessment of coursework, we want to separate grading from our direct assessments as much as possible. Grades are an implied and even indirect measure of student learning. Course grades, for example, can include accumulated points based on extra credit, attendance, participation, or other factors that are separate or in addition to demonstrating competency in certain areas. Even an assignment, project, or an exam can include numerous competencies that are incorporated into the resulting grade. So while we can use existing assignments and activities, we want to try to find a way to isolate the specific area of learning in the assignment or activity. Depending on the activity, there may already be a rubric available that can be used to measure assessment. Or a rubric can be created that is specifically designed for this assessment. How results are reported can vary. It could be a simple point system, such as a 1 to 5 scale, looking at percentages, or so on. If multiple faculty are involved in the assessment, then it will be important to have a norming session between reviewers so that there is a common understanding of how the rubric will be scored. This is called inter-rater reliability, or a way to mitigate as much subjective interpretation as possible between reviewers. This is especially important when assessing courses with multiple sections taught by multiple instructors. Finally, please note that value rubrics are available to download through AAC&U, which can be easily adapted for the specific needs of your assessment, and I've provided the link here on the slide. The next question on the template asks if any indirect assessments were used in your analysis. Indirect assessments are not required, but may be helpful in gathering qualitative feedback. As already mentioned, indirect assessments might include student surveys or information gathered from focus groups, activities which shed light on student perceptions and which may be very valuable when conducted alongside direct assessments and allow for a more holistic understanding of learning. The next question on the template asks what the results of the assessment were during this cycle. In particular, the question asks you to reflect on what your results suggest in terms of where students are with specific skills or competencies that are goals of your program. Please also keep in mind that assessment reporting does not have to be purely quantitative in reporting on findings in this section. While percentages and numerical scales can be very helpful to see trends in assessment, some programs may feel that qualitative reporting in terms of, in the form of a narrative might be more helpful in describing the observations they find. Please provide a summary of your findings for this question, including any data, tables, or results you wish to include that demonstrate the information gathered. The next question is one of the most important in terms of actionable change following assessment. How will you use your results to improve student learning? For actionable change, we refer to closing the loop activities, or in other words, efforts of continual improvement. These activities could include pedagogical changes such as design of assignments or rubrics, revising learning outcomes and syllabi or standard course outlines, or revisiting aspects of how a course is taught or how often a concept is reinforced in teaching. It could also include revising the larger curricular structure of the program, including sequences of when courses are taught, looking at how and when course concepts are introduced, when students should be mastering the material, and so on. Closing the loop also refers to a larger continuous cycle of seeking improvement in learning, which is illustrated in the graphic on the right. Ideally, department-level conversations would take place around the desired result of a designed assessment. The results of the findings would lead to further self-reflective conversations. What are we doing well, and where might we improve? Please note that any closing the loop changes should also be followed up in the future with their own assessments to see if positive changes were observed. Okay, let's briefly look at two examples of how annual assessment was approached recently on our campus. Our first example will be from the Department of Dance, who in 2019 assessed critical thinking skills in BA option and dance science majors as part of our core competency project. For this assessment, Dance used a final paper from the course Dance 442, Dance and Social Identity in the U.S., as the SLOs for this course aligned with several PLOs that addressed critical thinking skills. Since this was part of an isolated assessment project looking at WASC core competencies, which includes oral and written communication, critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, and information literacy, for Dance's assessment of critical thinking, more than one PLO was addressed. A three-person committee in Dance reviewed papers from students in the course, and they used the AAC&U value rubric for critical thinking, which they revised for their assessment. Prior to conducting the assessment, the three-person team met to discuss the rubric for a norming session. And at that meeting, they had a discussion about the measures listed in the rubric to make sure that they had a common understanding of how those criteria would apply to this level of undergraduate work. They assessed the papers using a 1 to 3 point scale, as you can see in the chart on the right, for each of the three categories on the rubric. The findings of this assessment showed some interesting trends, but primarily that dance science majors scored the highest in terms of providing evidence in their papers, yet scored lower on clarifying their position with regards to their personal perspectives. In terms of closing the loop activities, the Faculty of Dance used these findings to help inform their recent curriculum revisions, and in particular added more dance studies courses to the major pathway, particularly in the lower division. And in this way, they plan to bolster students' critical thinking skills with an earlier introduction to dance studies, as well as reinforcing critical thinking more consistently across their curriculum. For our second example, we'll look at a graduate program, the Master in Public Administration in the Department of Public Policy and Administration. For this assessment, the department assessed the PLO to participate in and contribute to the policy process, which is one of 5 broad umbrella competencies for the graduate program. The department looked at 2 graduate courses to assess learning of this PLO, Public Policy Administration 670 and 697. The direct assessment was completed by using a policy issue analysis case study, which measured student learning in policy problem evaluation, as well as in developing, assessing, and recommending policy solutions. And the direct assessment artifact that was used was a PPA 670 policy issue analysis case study called Bicycling and Coast City, which was submitted by students in their PPA 697 directed research course. A separate rubric was created to assess student learning through 30 random samples of students, which evaluated 4 areas for the rubric. 1, problem determination and formulation. 2, recommended policy alternative solutions. 3, policy alternative assessment and final recommendation. And 4, quality of writing and degree of original analysis. Each of the 4 areas was individually weighed and scored using a 100-point scale. The department found that students performed well overall for this assessment, producing scores in the mid to upper 90% range for 3 out of 4 areas of measurement. One area was an outlier, the policy alternatives assessment and final recommendation, though the average for these scores was still around 85%, and you can see those numbers in the graphic on the right. To mitigate these findings, the department decided to implement closing the loop strategies of emphasizing such policy analysis techniques, including benefit cost analyses, and so on, across all sections of the PPA 670 courses to ensure stronger student learning in this area. Okay, I hope it was helpful to look at 2 examples of assessment recently done by your colleagues on campus. Let's now finish talking about the template itself. The final question on the template asks for you to provide an update on your most recent MOU, or Memoranda of Understanding. MOUs list agreed-upon actions between department, college, and academic affairs from a program's most recent program review. You can find your program's most recent MOU posted at the website on this link. So to complete this question, you may need to dialogue with your department chair and other members of your department to see how your program is doing regarding the action items on the MOU. This brief progress report may include progress in areas such as assessment, but might also require updates related to resources or other items of importance to your particular program. And when you complete your next self-study, all your annual reports will be submitted, as well as this record of MOU progress. I hope this brief video was helpful in explaining annual assessment reporting. If you have any questions at all or would like more information on how to conduct meaningful assessment for your program, please don't hesitate to reach out. Please contact Lauren Johnson with any questions about annual assessment reports, assessment plans, curriculum maps, or program review questions related to self-studies or PARCC. If you have questions related to institutional level assessment, please reach out to Dr. Charlene Saya.